I do wish we were all in the same room, but it feels a bit like we are in the same room when we're all here together. It's fantastic to have such a big turnout. I should say quickly that I have two connections to Diane. Firstly, I was able to interview her when her book, The Collaborator, was released last year at the Sydney Jewish Museum, which was a great treat. And secondly, she was on the same boat that my family were on when they came to Australia. So we have lots of connections, and it's always lovely to be able to reconnect with her about her work. So as Anna said, thank you very much, Anna. The way we'll run today is that I'll speak with Diane for about 30 minutes, and then I'll leave a good 10 minutes at least for your questions. So if you think of them and you want to put them into the chat box. So I'm just going to interrupt Anna. People are saying, and I'm having the same issue, on my screen I can see a still photograph of you, Anna, but I'm not seeing the big screen of me. There's something about the way you've configured the view. And someone else has just said the same. Anna, are you able to have a little around for a moment?
In the top right-hand corner,
yep,
there's a button that says Gallery View or Speaker View. So everyone should click on Speaker View.
So I have, but I'm still only seeing you.
Okay, give me a minute and I'll just have a look.
Sorry, everyone. We'll just see if we can. There we go. There we go. Okay, there we go. That seems a bit better. Thank you, Anna. So yes, I will speak with Diane for about 30 minutes, leave time for your questions. If you think of them and you want to put them in the chat box over on the side of the screen, that's great, and we'll select them at the end. I wanted to just reference the fact that with Diane, we do want to talk about her previous work, and we certainly want to talk about The Collaborator. But I know, because I had a quick chat with Diane earlier in the week, that she is busy at home working, as all great writers do. She hasn't stopped. And I thought that's where I wanted to start today. I wanted to ask Diane to tell us a bit about what she's working on at the moment and what's at the heart of that story. Diane?
Up, down.
No, I can't find Diane.
I can see me.
Ah, there we go.
Yeah.
You're there. Okay. So Diane, what are you working on at the moment? What's at the heart of your new novel?
My new novel is set in Jersey, which is one of the Channel Islands, and it's set during the occupation. And the interesting thing is that, of course, when I started, which was several years ago, started researching it, I had no idea that it would resonate so much with what we're going through today. For instance, I'm reading about the restrictions people are living under, and I'm reading about the doctor whose patients are dying of pneumonia, and he wishes that there was some medication that he could give them to make them better, but there wasn't anything at the time. And I'm thinking, you know, this is very similar to the situation we're in today with the lack of a vaccine for COVID-19. There are all kinds of resonances that I'm discovering as I'm writing.
And I wanted to ask as well, it's a question that comes up a lot with your fiction, that did you know much about this particular area, the Channel Islands in Jersey, before you started writing the book? How did it come to be the focus of your new novel?
A few years ago, I visited Jersey, and I was absolutely blown away with the stories that I heard and the people that I met, including a guy that I met totally by chance, who told me that he was descended from a family that arrived in Jersey with William the Conqueror. That's how far back the link between Jersey and the British Empire goes. And I was blown away with the stories that I heard. And so that was on the back burner for some years. And then I visited again. And again, I was struck by all the fascinating stories. I had no idea when I went there that Jersey and the rest of the Channel Islands were the only part of the UK that were occupied by the Germans for the entire war. So that immediately gave it a very interesting aspect, particularly as there were Jews there who were deported by the Germans with the help of the authorities of the Channel Islands. And again, that gave it a very interesting point of view, because it made Jersey a sort of microcosm for what happened in the rest of Europe.
I didn't know about that history. It is extraordinary, that history. I didn't know about it either. I realise when we're looking at some of your previous novels as well, I'm thinking about Nocturne as an example, but it seems that at the heart of all of your writing, but particularly your fiction writing, are stories about, they're always stories about Jewish people and Jewish identity, but they're also stories about the Holocaust. And you're a wonderful writer with a lot of range. You've written non-fiction and fiction. You've been a long-standing journalist and award-winning story writer as well. But I wondered if you could talk today about why those stories are ones you come back to. Why are they at the heart of so much of what you write?
Well, I think the first and probably most obvious answer to that is that I am a child Holocaust survivor. And so the Holocaust has, in a way, been a defining event of my life. But as well as that, in the Holocaust and the things that happened, I find it a fascinating study of human behavior. The best and the worst of human behavior is demonstrated there. And I find that because it's such an incomprehensible event, even to us 75 years later, I find that if somehow through my stories I can shine some kind of a little light and illuminate something that seems so difficult to understand, I feel that that's something that I would be very happy to do.
When you are looking at writing, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, how much research is enough for you? Because it seems like, especially in the Collaborator, when I read that last year, that you create scenes that are so utterly believable, and yet we're never overwhelmed with detail. But how much research do you need to do in order to strike that balance?
Well, I do a lot of research, and in fact, I can tell you now that the research is the best part of the whole process, because it's so interesting to delve into any facts and then they lead to other facts, and it's very easy to become totally immersed in all the stories that emerge from the research. But then, of course, that can take me a couple of years. I'm one of these writers, and I know it's different for everybody, but I like to really get a firm grip on the facts before I start writing the fiction. And so I research for a long time. And then, of course, comes the terrible moment of truth when I have to sit down in front of the computer and start making some sense out of all the fascinating things I've been learning. And so the research often takes as long as if not longer, than the actual writing.
When did you start writing the new book?
This one, I started writing pretty well just before we went into lockdown. And so in a way, the lockdown has been a great boon for me from that point of view, because I don't have any excuses. I can't say I've got to go and meet somebody or go to a concert or a movie. I'm here, and so is the computer. And so I just sit down and start writing.
It sounds like you're one of that wonderful minority of people for whom there have been mostly upsides to having to be locked at home, which is wonderful. You're a very good person for us to speak to at this moment, I think. But you know, as you have referenced, they're very strange times we live in. You know, pandemics like this are once every 50 odd years, and here we are, smack bang in the middle of it. And these kinds of experiences lead all of us to new insights, or they bring up new worries or old worries. And I wondered if you could share with us what this strange time of more social isolation, I know you're a writer and you have to stay at home anyway, but what kind of insights has it brought up for you about how you think about yourself, or how you think about how you live in the world?
Well, that's a very good question, Michaela. I think several things. First of all, I've noticed that it's an enforced way of slowing down. I don't know how everybody else's life is, but I know my life at times is a bit like being on a treadmill. You make arrangements, you're running from one thing to another, you're meeting this person here and that person there, you're going out to dinner, you're going to meet friends, you go to movies, concerts, theatres, and life is wonderful and very, very busy. It doesn't allow for a lot of time to just slow down. And so what I'm finding is that it's actually rather refreshing to just, what do they say, stop and smell the roses. Just stop and look around and be in the present moment, rather than looking forward to the next activity.
I know you and I we got dressed for an interview this morning as if we were all together, because we are. But I need to know the important question. When you are relaxing at home and writing, are you a tracksuits and pajamas all day kind of writer?
No, I'm not a tracksuit and pajama writer or a tracksuit and pajama person at all. I think I got that from my mother. I never ever saw my mother without lipstick on, ever, and her hair done. And I think maybe that sort of modeling sort of stays in your mind subconsciously forever. But also I just feel better when I'm dressed and ready for the day. And don't forget, I've always worked at home. So home to me is like my office. And I just feel more ready for the day. I get dressed as soon as I'm up, and I either go for a walk and do some yoga to start with. And lately I've been doing bridge webinars. I've got wonderful bridge teachers who have kindly offered webinars in the absence of face-to-face bridge. And then I sit down and write. And I just find that that really works for me. And I don't think I would be happy sitting in pajamas. I don't think I'd get anything written.
I've seen that there are a lot of lists making the internet at the moment. And one of the lists about how to navigate the day when we're all at home is to get dressed, at least to get dressed before midday. They say have a shower and get dressed. So it's obviously an important part of things. As you mentioned, you've always worked from home. Your home has always been your office. You were a freelance writer for decades. And for a lot of people, that's not their life. You know, work is about leaving the domestic space. Work is about connecting with other people and talking to other people. What are some of the tips that you think you could share with people for how they can, I mean, you just shared your daily routine, which I think is really interesting about how we all navigate and break up the day or shape our day. What are some of the other tips that you could share with people about how to make the day feel more like our own lives and less like we have no idea what's coming tomorrow?
Well, I think one of the most useful things that I've heard since we went into lockdown is an interview that I saw with Natan Sharansky. Natan Sharansky was a Russian dissident, and he was imprisoned in Russia, I think it was in the early 70s, for 9 years. Half of that time he spent in solitary, and he gave a fantastic interview recently, and he said he has some tips because as someone who was put in jail with no idea how long he was going to be in there or if he was ever going to come out, he had to somehow depend on himself to find strategies to survive emotionally and psychologically. And one of the things he said was this: you don't know when or if this is going to end, and it's not up to us. We can't depend on outside influences or facts. So the only thing we can depend upon is ourselves. Now, what can we depend on? We can depend on doing something that gives us pleasure. We can depend on something that we can live in the moment and try and extract whatever pleasure we can from what we see and what we can do. He, for instance, used to play chess in his head when he was in solitary confinement. Now, he doesn't suggest that we should do that, and luckily we don't have to, but in a way, it's really a clue to finding ways of doing something that has always been in our mind. Maybe the bucket list. Maybe you've always wanted to learn a language. Maybe you've always wanted to learn some physical thing. Maybe you've always wanted to do yoga. So he suggests set yourself a goal that is dependent on you and not dependent on outside influences. And above all, he said, remember, you're part of a global community. You're not alone, and stay connected.
He's a wonderful, wonderful man. I knew his name, but after you mentioned him, I looked him up. And for people who don't know Natan Sharansky, perhaps you do. He's a human rights activist. He was an Israeli politician. And famously, he was the first political prisoner that Gorbachev agreed to do a prisoner swap for. He was in prison in Russia, in the Soviet Union, for at least 9 years before he was released, and then traded with Israel. He's a fascinating guy, and it's a great short video. Perhaps we'll get Anna to share it with all the people who are attending this morning after our session. I also wanted to ask you, this is a moment, I know you're working and writing at home, but I wondered as well what you're reading that you're finding inspiring or that's taking you away.
I've been reading quite a lot. Obviously, that's another thing that I've been able to do without feeling guilty about it because there's so much time. And the other thing I didn't mention that I find gives me an awful lot of pleasure is listening to music. And I find that very inspiring and calming. But my reading lately, I read a very interesting book by a Jewish writer called Danny Shapiro called Inheritance. And that's a book, it's a biography, or a memoir really, in which she describes the process she went through when she discovered that the man that she had believed was her father for 54 years of her life, she discovered by a chance DNA test that he was not her biological father. And so the shock and her total confusion overwhelmed her as to how she was going to live her life from now on, not knowing who she really was. And so she traces the ways in which she actually did track down her biological father. And I found that was very well written and a very interesting story, because you just imagine at the age of 54, you discover that you're not really who you think you are, or at least your father is not who you thought it was. So interestingly enough, she always thought she was adopted, or she hoped she was, but it was her mother that she thought was not her real mother. And of course, it was the other way around.
She had an instinct. Yeah.
She felt she didn't fit in, which was interesting. The other book that I read was very different, is a book called American Dirt by an American writer called Jeanette Cummins. And that's a very interesting book. It's about a Mexican woman who discovers that she is the target of the cartel, who have already killed almost all her family except her and her little son. And the book is really her struggle to escape from the cartel. And she travels all over Mexico. And of course, her aim is to get to the United States.
What did you love about American Dirt? It's a book that's on a lot of bestsellers lists, and it's a lot of people dying to read it, but there's been quite a lot of sort of controversy around it as well. What grabbed you about American Dirt?
I just found it was very gripping, very believable. I really felt that she created the character of Lydia, who was the main character, so believably, and you just felt for her terror and her courage in all the things that she had to do to try and escape from the clutches of the cartel. Now, interestingly, you mentioned the flack that the book has got, and I felt that that was I found it was unjustified. And let me just explain for
Please.
those. Yes, some critics have panned the book because Jeanette Cummins is not Mexican. Now, this is part of this current fashion that says you're not allowed to write about cultures or nationalities that you're not part of. And I just find that an absolutely extraordinary attitude to fiction, because after all, I think fiction, the criterion is really, is it believable? Is it well written? I mean, surely the idea of fiction is the use of imagination. And if authors can't put themselves imaginatively into the lives of other people, wherever they may be, then perhaps they shouldn't be writing fiction.
You've tapped into two things very powerfully. One is that when fiction grips us, we feel like it's real. And the other thing is that I think sometimes maybe I know you're right, this moment we're experiencing, there's a lot of, an American Dirt's not the only book, and there are other similar issues coming up around festivals. If we have a panel, for example, on people of colour, can it be moderated by somebody, or can there be a speaker on it who's not a person of colour? So those kinds of topics are coming up, and it seems almost like a kind of counterbalance, which is that perhaps people who wanted to tell their own stories or write their own stories didn't have the platform or weren't being given publishing deals to do so. But I think ultimately, as you say, the very big test, and often the very hard test, is how do readers feel about it? Does it ring true for them in some way? Does it feel like it could be a real voice, a real story? I haven't read American Dirt, but hearing you talk about it, it's now moved closer.
Well, you know, that sort of attitude that you have to be of the same culture as the people you're writing about, that to me implies that there's some sort of a shortage of stories, that there's only 2 or 3 stories, and if you write one, then you're taking away from the fund of stories that are available for people of that culture to write. Now, I just don't see it that way. I think that there's an infinite number of stories, and if you're a good novelist, then you, as you say, you'll make it believable, and people will be totally immersed in the world that you've created. If you're not a good writer and it's not believable, that can happen if you're in the same culture as well.
Absolutely, I thought of that as well. Just because it's your story, sorry, doesn't mean you can always write it well. In fact, sometimes you need someone with some kind of distance to do so. But it is also a topic that does come up in the Jewish community, in Jewish writing, or in writing about the Holocaust. Where we've had people like Heather Morris as an example, where they are not directly part of the culture, but writing about an event historically that's affected Jewish people. So there are lots of intricacies to how people approach that. But as you say as well, it's about ultimately it comes down to the power of the writer to shape a world that we can engage with in a way that's really truthful and emotionally truthful.
Yes, yeah, because I think if you carry it to its logical extreme, then you're going to have to espouse a position which says, if you haven't been to Auschwitz, you can't write about it. It's that kind of attitude, and I don't agree with it.
We may be in one of those moments. We go through them cyclically where we're having a reaction that may be an overreaction, but it's very interesting to see what's coming out of this. And I think the fact that we're having these conversations, or that there are these debates happening, are really valuable, because it does allow us to acknowledge that there have been people left out of the space in which they could tell their own stories. And sometimes that's a simple gatekeeper reason, the way that they might not have been able to get a publishing deal, or they might not have been able to get someone to buy their script. They might not have been able to get funding or get through the door. So I think the fact that all those gatekeepers are changing means that the people who can tell stories or learn to tell stories in powerful ways is also changing. And I think that can only be for the better. There was one other book you mentioned.
I'm reading now a fascinating book called The Seal Woman's Gift. So a friend of mine recommended it. And again, that's actually another illustration of this discussion we're having now. It's set in Iceland in the 17th century, and the author is Scottish. Now, she has evoked Iceland in the 1600s brilliantly, even the conversations and the characters and the situations, and I'm totally engrossed in it.
Sounds wonderful. You've given us a lot more to add to our list of things we have to do while we're at home, which is good. We talked a little bit about your writing process, but I wanted to ask you about technology. It sounds like a lot of the research you do, you use technology to do. But how do you feel about now this shift we've gone into? You and I are taking advantage of it, of using a lot more technology now in our everyday, in our hour-to-hour life.
Well, I think it's brilliant. And in fact, that's one of the things that I was thinking about when you asked me about life under lockdown, is how fortunate we all are, forgetting writing, to have all these tools at our disposition that we can so easily connect. We can use the internet, we can use our phones. It's, we've got Netflix if we really want to totally relax and veg out. But, we have so many aids to make life a little richer and less restricted. But coming back to my research, when I research, I do it in various ways. When I'm researching something like the Collaborator, for instance, where the action happened in Budapest and Israel, then I traveled to Budapest and Israel as well, to get myself into the atmosphere of the place and talk to people and see the streets and just get the general atmosphere. I find that's absolutely irreplaceable. But as well as traveling to the places that I write about, I read a lot of books. I read memoirs, I read history books, I read autobiographies, I read documents, so that all those things are available. The documents are often available online, and that makes my life a lot easier. And altogether, I think all those things together, the books, the internet, and the traveling, combined to give me all the information that I need. And of course, I talk to people locally. For instance, when I was writing the Collaborator, I was fortunate enough to come across people who actually either had parents or knew of friends who'd been rescued by Reznor Kessner. on his rescue train. And so that gave me another dimension to the story.
Those people who you met, had they ever told those stories before? Were you the first person they shared those sort of secrets with?
I'm not sure. I think some might have been. I gave a talk at Waverley Library a few months ago, and at the end of my talk, a woman put up her hand, and she said that actually, she said her parents were saved by Reggio Kessner, and not only that, but that her father had been a very close friend of his. And she was able to give a really interesting insight into the man who'd been so, in my opinion, unfairly judged and vilified over the years, and continues to be so by a number of people. But her insights that she gave were absolutely incredible. And to think that, you know, there was this woman who just came to hear me speak, and she had this first-hand experience of the man on whose story I based the book.
When I think about the reporting that we've had, I promise this is going in a direction back to the Collaborator, the reporting about COVID-19, a lot of the first waves of people talking about it were that we started talking about the Spanish flu. We were looking at the past to sort of make sense of how to navigate the present. And it's something you do very brilliantly in the Collaborator, where there's a story strand that's set in the present day, and there's a story strand that's the Reggio Kessner story, where we go back in time. Why do you often use that juxtaposition, that jumping between present day and past? What does it allow you to explore or to shine a light on?
Well, I think very often we forget that the past is really a torchlight that can shine a very bright light on the present. And sometimes you need that perspective of the present to elicit that. And that's what I use in the Collaborator. And of course, I don't want to say too much about the connections, but of course there is a personal connection as well in the Collaborator that the heroine Annika discovers as she searches. And in a way, she's like the writer of Inheritance. She has a sense that something is driving her to research something to find out about this man. And of course there is something, but it's totally unconscious and buried deep inside her psyche that she was not aware of.
I wanted to ask you as well, and I urge people who have, I think a lot of people who are here on the chat today have read the Collaborator, and I urge you to read it. It's one of those lovely combinations of being an extraordinarily great page turner as well as being a very gripping story. And as you say, Diane, so many people, once you start mentioning Reggio Kessner's name, so many people have a story about him or a connection to him, which is really interesting. I wanted to come back to where we are today, which is, you know, all together but in our homes, all together but not able to hug each other, or not able to have had a Passover meal together or a Shabbat meal together. I wondered if you had any thoughts about how you think people might be changed after months of social isolation. Do you think we're going to come out better or not?
I think we're going to appreciate the things that we took for granted. Like we might have taken our Friday nights for granted. We might have taken our coffee meetings with our friends for granted. It was just another thing that we did. And suddenly, as you say, we don't do it anymore. And I think that probably, certainly in my case, I think has made me much more appreciative of what I had. And I think it's going to make me appreciate it even more when it comes back again and we're able to hug our lovely grandchildren and our children and see the faces in real life, not just on Zoom screens.
You mentioned earlier, and I know people know that about you, that you are a child of the Holocaust. So on days at home, when worry creeps in, when old things come up, how do you manage them?
I think I'm very fortunate that I have a very positive attitude, and I think I got that possibly from my parents, who were Holocaust survivors, but they were positive, optimistic people, and they didn't dwell on things. And I think possibly I've inherited that quality. I'm able to enjoy the moment. I try not to dwell. Look, obviously I'm aware of the uncertainties. They're very unsettling. It's very upsetting to read about the things that are happening to people, especially in America, in England, in Spain, in Italy, and of course to some extent here too. But I try not to dwell on that. I'm aware of it. I watch the news. I feel very grateful that I'm in a safe place so far. That seems okay, but I'm aware that it may not remain so. I just try and focus on the positive things, and I think there are a lot of them, and that's, I think, what keeps me from giving into a feeling of depression.
Thank you. I wanted to leave some time now for questions from people who are with us this morning. So if you have a question that you'd love me to put to Diane, feel free to pop it into the chat box. There was one earlier in our session that I wanted to put to you now, which is about the Collaborator. And it was about your depiction of the judge in the libel case in the Collaborator. And the question was, how, for people who have read the book, I hope that's most people, how accurate was your depiction of that judge? Do you think he was motivated by his grievance of not being appointed to the Supreme Court, or was he motivated by something else?
Well, it's always very difficult to know what motivates judges, and I think those of us that follow current cases and judgments often wonder what on earth is going on in the judge's mind. In that particular case, I read quite a lot about the judge, and I did wonder, I think, first of all, he started off being quite sympathetic to Kessner, but as time went on, he did change his attitude, and whether that was entirely because of the evidence in front of him, or whether, as I suggested, he was motivated by a sense of grievance that he'd been overlooked for the top job that he wanted. That I don't really, it's impossible to know. But this is the advantage of fiction. I'm able to, by changing the names and the details, the character becomes a character in my novel. And in my novel, this was a man that possibly was motivated by that sense of grievance.
So he was human.
Yes, yes.
There's a good question here from Ludmilla, which I've thought about as well when I read your books. At what stage do you introduce fictionalized characters and events into otherwise historically based novels? And I would add as well, do you see a danger in doing that too soon or too late?
Well, I think that, again, in a way, it's what I said earlier. Sometimes you need a character in the present to shine a light on what happened in the past. But as far as turning things into fiction, I'm not writing history. I'm not writing biography, you see. And so I'm writing fiction. And so as a fiction writer, I have the latitude to invent characters. So that, for instance, I was able to invent the lover for Kessner and all the details that went with it, which had nothing to do with the real person, but this is my fictional character and this was what he did. And so this is one of the things I really like about writing fiction, that it does give me the freedom to invent characters, situations, and motives that otherwise I wouldn't be able to do if I was writing nonfiction.
I wanted to ask as well, as another good question that's come through, has the present isolation situation changed the way you're thinking about your current writing, or has it inspired any new ideas or new material for you?
Well, yes, it has. That is a good question. It has affected me because, for instance, as I said before, I'm writing my new novel, which is called Dancing with the Enemy. And I've got one of my main characters is, I think I mentioned before, a doctor. And the doctor is thinking about the situation that they're in, occupied by Germany. They're part of the British Empire. And I've got him saying at one point, how did this happen to us? Life was so wonderful. And I'm thinking, yes, that's exactly how you would feel. And that is probably how we feel. So in a way, what we're going through does inform what I'm writing.
I wanted to ask a few other questions, if I could, just about the new novel that you're working on. How many story strands are there in the new book? Because like in the Collaborator, there are mostly 2 that we're following. And I suppose as well, is that a kind of a new challenge for you as well, about trying to weave in multiple stories and weave them together and make them all fit?
Well, what I found when I started writing or started thinking about my new novel is that there were so many amazing stories, and I thought, how am I going to weave them all in without sort of sounding as though it's overloaded? And so I've decided to write it from the point of view of three main characters. And one of them is a young Australian doctor who's been an intern in a big teaching hospital and who is absolutely stressed, brought absolutely to the edge by the stresses and overwork and exhaustion of her job. So she travels to the Channel Islands, and in the Channel Islands, back in this is the modern story, in 1940, there was a doctor and he wrote a memoir, he wrote a journal. In those days, during the war, people were encouraged to keep a journal of daily events, like, you know, to keep a record of what happened to them during the war. So that's a really good vehicle for me to write about what happened to this doctor. And then the third character is a young boy who is in a very stressful, resentful, rebellious situation, which is caused by the occupation and by the behavior of his parents, especially his mother. And so those three stories are going to be interwoven.
Fantastic. Someone has written to us that what they love about your captivating fiction is that they come away feeling historically educated as well as enjoying a work of fiction, which is a great treat. If there are no other questions from our wonderful audience, if there anything else you'd like me to ask Diane, I'm happy to put it to her. I think we will hand back over to Anna Stern, but I want to say for my part, thank you to everybody for being with us this morning, and thank you very much to Diane as well for giving us some time and showing us your workspace, your study behind you, which I like to see.
Well, this has been a wonderful opportunity for me to tidy it up, knowing that it's going to be on show.
Very good, very good. There is one last question that's just popped through now. What made you choose to be a writer? When did you decide to be a writer?
Well, apparently, my mother told me when I was 7 years old, I told her I was going to be a writer. Now, where did that come from? I was an only child. I grew up before computers, mobile phones, all the paraphernalia that we have now. I read a lot, and maybe that came from those two things. One, that I was an only child, and two, that I read a lot, and I got completely lost in the stories that I read, and maybe that's what made me decide. I never ever wanted to be anything else. That's all I've ever wanted to do, and I feel I'm incredibly lucky that I have been able to do it.
Wonderful. On that note, thank you very much, Diane, and we're going to hand back over to Anna.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for that wonderful interview, Diane and Michaela. Sorry, I'll be one moment. Just bear with me. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my video working. Okay. No, that was really, yeah, wonderful. So thank you once again to both of you. And Diane, a really special thank you for coming back and addressing the Sydney Jewish Writers Festival once again. It's wonderful, you know, to check in again, to hear how you are through this lockdown situation, but to hear also about what you've been working on, about the research for your upcoming book, and also to receive that wonderful reading list from you. And also, I think what was, you know, as someone who's so expert as a writer at spending your days alone, or, you know, your days at home, it was particularly interesting to hear about how, you know, how you structure your day, as you said, how you get dressed every day and get ready for the day, and how some of your hobbies and interests like bridge have moved online. So thank you very much for that. At the end of last week's event with Ariel Berger, I said that it was important for us to continue our conversations about ideas and books and memory and culture to sustain us through this period. And this conversation, Diane, has done just that. And I think you've inspired us even more with your reading recommendations and the conversation you had with Michaela now about how you work, how you research, and what you mentioned as well about the importance of the important role that historical events, what historical events play in our lives, and the relevance of history to contemporary events like today, which I think you emulate through your books, but you demonstrated in today's conversation as well. Michaela, once again, thank you as always for a fantastically well-researched interview. And it's always wonderful to have an interviewer, you know, who's so not only familiar with the author's works, but someone who's interviewed, you know, the author. So you've interviewed Diane before and you followed her career, and also have that wonderful personal connection about your families coming to Australia on the same ship. So thank you again to both of you. And thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us once again, for all your comments and your questions that you shared in the chat box. Diane's books will be available, as I mentioned. They're in stock at Gertrude and Alice, who are our official Jewish Writers Festival bookshop partner. And I'll be sending out details after, so you can order them and they will happily deliver them to your place, to your homes. In the next few days, I'll also be sending out a recording of today's interview so that you can rewatch it or share it with friends or family. And I'll also send out the wonderful recommendations, that reading list that Diane shared with us. We will be having more Sydney Jewish Writers Festival events online in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out for emails from us. And in the meantime, please take care of yourselves, keep well, keep reading. And I look forward to seeing you online and in person very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Good.